I swear to God, when you look at the current situation in the country, they've shut down the central bank and left people in a terrible state. Just look around. The shops are empty. There are no services. Nothing at all. They've cut off electricity. Cash is scarce. And there's even a shortage of gasoline. They won't let us move, live or work. Honestly, I have no idea where they're trying to take us. May God protect the country, and I pray that He brings us what is good and right for the nation.
The past decade and a bit have proved difficult for Libya. Since the bloody uprising that removed Gaddafi from power, the North African nation has experienced civil war, social problems, political corruption, and a host of other issues. And on August 16th, more trouble. An armed group descended on the Central Bank of Libya in the country's capital, Tripoli. They demanded that the governor of the bank, Sadiq al-Kabir, leave his position and the institution. He sent a pretty clear response when he refused to step down and halted all banking operations. After a tense few days, Kabir did leave the bank and then the country, and a new interim governor was named. This week, who was trying to get rid of the governor, and why did they want him gone? Can a new governor and board of the bank restore some sense of stability? And what does this mean for the future of Libya's fragmented leadership? My name's Hugo Goodridge, and you're listening to The New Arab Voice. While infrequently quiet, the Middle East and North Africa has been particularly busy and particularly horrifying over the past 11 months. But you may not have been paying too much attention to Libya. So, a brief revision course.
I would tend to say that your listeners should imagine two dynastic, non-democratic families.
This is Jalel Harchaoui, Associate Fellow with the Royal United Services Institute in London.
One by the name of Dbeibeh, the family of the Prime Minister, who controls parts of Tripoli. Not all of Tripoli, parts of Tripoli. And there's another dynastic, non-democratic, rather authoritarian family that holds power in Benghazi in the east. And that particular family, the Haftar family, controls the entire eastern half of the country and a lot of the southern half of the country. So one is really characterized by its military power and sheer amount of surface of land that it more or less controls. It's not perfect, but it's rather unitary as a provincial dictatorship, if you will. And then in Tripoli, you have a prime minister who has been able to use his talent for money arrangements with a motley set of armed groups that allow him to hold court in Tripoli and govern from there, more or less. So the country is still divided.
A divided nation with two governments. In the western capital of Tripoli, the Government of National Unity, formed in 2021, which was recognised by the United Nations and is led by Prime Minister Abdul Hamid Dbeibeh. In the east, the Libyan House of Representatives and the Libyan National Army, led by Khalifa Haftar. They are not recognised by the UN, but are supported by some powerful allies, including Russia. There was a time when parts of the east were in the Government of National Unity, but to avoid confusion, just know that now they're not anymore. A nation divided like this is far from perfect. But it is worth noting that
Libya has not experienced any sustained bout of war fighting since June 2020. So that's more than 4 years ago was the last serious episode of a civil war. So there's always this phrase that Libya is in conflict. It hasn't been in conflict for a while now.
Considering where Libya has come from, divided but without conflict is a relatively good place for the country to be in. But what about its recent troubles with the central bank? It all started in August with a group of armed men surrounding the central bank in Libya. It wasn't immediately clear where their loyalties lay, nor where they took their orders from. It did seem clear that they were not at the bank to open a new savings account. On August 16th, armed men entered the home of Musab Musallam, the head of the Central Bank's Information Technology Department, and kidnapped him. One day later, in response to the kidnapping, Central Bank Governor Sadiq al-Kabir announced that he was ceasing operations at the bank until the employee was released, which he was a day later. With more shadowy and aggressive measures failing, the head of Libya's Presidential Council announced that the governor of the central bank, Kabir, had been fired and that a new interim governor and board had been appointed in their place. Following this announcement, there were more raids by unidentified gunmen. Then it was announced that responsibility for the security of the bank had been taken over by the Ministry of the Interior, whose head was appointed by Prime Minister Dbeibeh. Dbeibeh accused the governor of mishandling funds. Kabir might not be a golden child of banking regulations, and his past is clouded by allegations of previous indiscretions, but also at the time, Dbeibeh did not provide any evidence for his claims. Efforts to remove Governor Kabir and the bank's board were rejected by the High State Council, which advises both East and West governments, and Eastern political bodies, including the largest, the House of Representatives. Also in response to events in Tripoli, Eastern forces shut down Libya's oil fields, which are critical to Libya's economy and the livelihoods of many Libyans. By the end of August, Governor Kabir and a handful of other members of staff, reportedly critical to the running of the bank, had fled the country. Kabir told a reporter from the Financial Times, quote, "Militias are threatening and terrifying bank staff and are sometimes abducting their children and relatives to force them to go to work." Did you follow all that? To summarise, Prime Minister Abdul Hamid Dbeibeh wanted to remove and replace Central Bank Governor Sadiq al-Kabir. When the governor was fired, Eastern rivals complained and the vital oil fields were shut down. There are a number of questions worth asking about the recent events. Let's start with why. Why do they want to control the central bank? What powers would be granted to the person that holds the central bank?
I mean, it's not so much the powers that it would give them, it's the resources that it would provide them.
This is Tarek Megerisi, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations in the Middle East and North Africa programme, with a focus on North Africa.
So previous prime ministers over the kind of last 10 years of degradation have created accommodations with the central bank governor, Sadiq al-Kabir, and everything has kind of ticked along. But for a number of reasons, the prime minister now felt both that he needed to make a play for the bank in order to protect his kind of political position in Tripoli and his ability to maintain his network of alliances.
With the central bank in his control, Dbeibeh would hold the keys to a vital Libyan institution. And it probably goes without saying that control over the central bank would also give control over the vast oil revenues that are supposed to be deposited into the central bank.
Libya's politicians and political class, elite class, however you want to refer to them, they are fully focused on growing their own power base and growing their control over Libya's wealth. And control over that wealth, by and large, sits in the central bank.
An effort to control a powerful institution and have control over vast financial wealth. Both classic reasons as to why they would do this. There is another reason. Jalel Harchaoui again.
A very key moment arose in July 2022, encouraged by the UAE. That was more than just a broker. It was an enthusiastic lobbyist, an enthusiastic defender of what I'm about to describe. Was this idea that the Dbeibeh family was going to, as a gift, as an offering, was going to install at the helm of the National Oil Corporation a Libyan who has been, still is, completely on the side of Haftar.
Back in 2022, an effort was launched to remove the head of a powerful institution and a replacement parachuted into their place. Sound familiar? It should. It's basically what Dbeibeh has attempted to do with the central bank. Why would Dbeibeh move against the central bank? Because he believed he could. Because a similar move, that time with the National Oil Company, had successfully been made in Libya's recent past. By all accounts, that worked. This recent effort with the central bank has not.
The replacement of the chairman of the National Oil Company was actually done through a process of negotiation between the Dbeibehs and the Haftars that was guaranteed by a third state. It was the United Arab Emirates who hosted the mediation and the negotiations between the two, and kind of came to this conclusion or this agreement whereby they would appoint Farhad bin Gaddara as the new NOC chairman. And so the handover was a bit smoother because there was less political pushback, given that the two major families in Libya supported this move. But also the incumbent chairman of the time was unable to really cling on to his position. I think they moved very quickly to bar him by force from re-entering. And so they essentially just created the fact on the ground.
Oil is another key part of the story when talking about Libya's central bank. Libya has the largest oil reserves in Africa and the 9th biggest in the world. Oil constitutes 97% of Libya's exports and more than 90% of its fiscal revenues and 68% of its GDP. In 2023, a revenue-sharing agreement was formed between the rival Eastern and Western governments. Revenue-sharing deals should typically be designed to be fair and transparent.
It wasn't fair, it wasn't transparent, it wasn't, I think deal is a too noble a word. It wasn't institutionalized. It wasn't in the form of a budget law or a spreadsheet or some kind of a table or a schedule that clarifies everything for everyone. It was something that has effectively been a moving target. It has been a dynamic thing where you could probably summarize the situation that in the following way. More and more of the oil wealth has been monetized by the Haftar family without going through the traditional plumbing with the act of selling the crude against dollars and then sending the dollars to the central bank in Tripoli, and then have the Central Bank of Tripoli split the money in a neat and visible way.
With such an informal and opaque deal, former Governor Kabir and the central bank, which is supposed to receive, hold and distribute all the revenues from oil sales, was in a difficult situation.
So if you're the governor of the central bank, and this perception is absolutely crucial here because we're here to talk about the central bank crisis. If you're the central bank governor sitting in Tripoli, you see roughly the same amount of production, roughly 1.25 million barrels a day over the last couple of years. But the amount of dollars flowing into your coffers has been shrinking over time. And that has made his situation unsustainable. And all the more unsustainable that the Dbeibeh family in Tripoli has been pressuring him, the governor, to give them more and more budget money. Things have been rotting away. There's been a time decay phenomenon with drifts and abuses and changes over time.
The revenues from oil sales are vital to Libya's economy and its people. Almost a third of Libya's working population relies exclusively on government-paid salaries. The salaries for these employees accounts for 53.8% of Libya's budget. It's also vital for the elites, who seek to control its flow to benefit their patronage networks. When the crisis around the central bank and Sadiq al-Kabir's position arose, the powers in the east and its forces chose to respond by closing down production at the oil fields, resulting in an immediate drop in output.
In July, I think, with the last numbers I saw, Libya exported about 1.2 million barrels per day. So far, the last numbers I saw a few days ago is that this is now dropped by 700,000 barrels per day, which means that just about 60% of Libya's oil output has cut so far. And it's expected to drop further to about 1 million, as in like they will lose 1 million barrels per day of exports. So it's quite a significant drop.
As previously mentioned, Libya's economy is almost entirely reliant on oil revenues. A drop of 60% is really bad news. Further drops have the potential to be disastrous.
The severity of this for Libya's economy depends on how long the oil blockade lasts. I mean, you could estimate that Libya has maybe 50 billion US dollars in foreign exchange reserves, so it's got enough to be ticking over. But a prolonged cut would really hurt Libya's income. We've seen previously that during times of long cuts, public sector expenditure drops, salary payments drop, even kind of militias and armed groups who depend on feeding from the public sector purse start to then predate more in kind of illegal or gangsterish activities. You even have these weird side effects like, when the oil fields are down, you don't get enough condensate coming out, so you can't fuel power stations anymore. So you start to get long power shortages.
These cuts are also on top of the economic troubles that the Libyan people were already suffering from.
As the number of dollars going into the usual channels or the official channels typically overseen by the central bank, as the number of dollars actually diminishes over time, it means that the dinar is less and less sustained by foreign exchange in general. And what Libyans have noticed, both in the black market and also in the official rate, is that the dinar has weakened, which means effectively runaway inflation. So obviously there's no free lunch, as more and more of the oil wealth has been subtracted from the usual circuit. All Libyans, I'm talking about the ordinary citizens, I'm not talking about the elites, obviously, who have been making money more than they know what to do with. But I'm talking about the citizens. They have been suffering increasingly. And of course, when you have an oil blockade, what happens in the black market is that the dinar weakens even further, which means that when you go and physically try to buy food or medicines, you have to pay more dinars. So there's an impoverishment. Like, obviously the capacity of Libyans has been painfully increasing over time.
Frankly, if we're being generous, we would call the closing of the oil fields a form of extortion. Do what we want, or we'll continue to ruin the economy. There is another option for Haftar and the East: a renewal of violence and potentially a return to the civil war that tore the country apart and killed countless people between 2014 and 2020.
Because I think Haftar ideally would like to do both, and one doesn't preclude the other. Neither Haftar nor his son, who is kind of leading the military moves at this time, have made any secret of their desire to eventually reclaim Tripoli. There were very strong and well-sourced rumors that recent troop movements about 3 weeks ago, where, large columns of forces went from eastern Libya to the west, were initially planned in order to inch Haftar's zone of influence closer to Tripoli and to start claiming parts of western Libya. It didn't play out. And I don't think that this kind of oil blockade precludes a military move on Tripoli. I think that's still very much Haftar's end goal. But for the time being, I think it was the most dramatic move that he could make. And it was probably an immediate way to put pressure on the Dbeibehs, but B, it also kind of quite savvily feeds in to this environment of economic panic, this idea that changing the central bank governor as a standalone event has plunged Libya into instability, into economic uncertainty.
Despite the closure of the oil fields, Sadiq al-Kabir was not reinstalled as the governor of Libya's central bank. In his place, Abdel Fattah Kafar was named as the interim governor by Dbeibeh. In a press conference, he attempted to project a sense of stability.
The transfer of power, which was an administrative handover, took place in a simple and smooth manner. No doors or keys were broken, and no office was entered by force. Everything took place in a smooth manner.
But his appointment did not solve any problems. If anything, it created more problems.
When you talk about oil, or when you talk about territory and physical things that happen to be in your country, and you're an armed group, or you're a bunch of armed groups, and you take them over physically, when they become yours, right? If you take over an airport, even if there's no law that says that you should be responsible for that airport, or for that oil field, or for that oil terminal, or gas well, if you call the shots on the ground physically as this big, scary force, then at the end of the day, it becomes yours. You become responsible, and everybody will accept that, especially outside of the country.
But that doesn't work with a bunch of dollars that sit in New York City with US banks like JP Morgan or Bank of New York Mellon, who care about US law, who care about US rules when it comes to combating money laundering and terror financing, who care about being compliant with international law, which means that they listen to the official version of the Department of State and the Department of Treasury. Those private entities, very powerful, really don't care about which building was taken over by which shabby militia in Tripoli. They just don't care.
This poses a serious problem for the newly announced leadership at the central bank.
So if one governor happens to be recognized correctly or incorrectly from a moral perspective, but legally in the interpretation of the United States and the UN has been perceived as the lawful governor, and you want to change him, push him out and replace him with someone that you like, you need a legislative event to take place that is actually recognized outside of Libya. You have to be able to convince with a piece of paper that you call a law that kind of at least should come across as plausible from a legal perspective and be able to show it to the UN, to Washington, and from there, be in a position to convince JP Morgan that they should not listen to the instructions of the former governor and listen to you instead. And that legislative step is missing. That actually was missing on August 18th. Those international financial institutions are all saying, wait a minute. Maybe the incumbent governor is in trouble, but the new one, we're not going to listen to right away. We're just not going to listen to him right away.
And if they're not going to listen, no business, no transactions, and no financial action.
Libya can no longer import food, import medicines, insulin pens, or bricks, or cement, or vehicles, or anything like, or fund scholarships, or anything that. Everything has been kind of on pause since August 26th, I think, when the governor had to leave the country.
And I probably don't need to tell you that when a country cannot import food and medicine, serious problems arise for the people, and in time, potentially its leaders.
Dbeibeh's network of loyalties, like anybody else in Libya, is based purely on how much money he can give people. It's a patronage network. So if he really loses the ability to pay salaries and to be seen as a provider and a head of a patronage network, then yeah, his base will start to erode, first gradually, then very suddenly. But I think we're still a while off that happening.
One small business owner expressed his frustration to a reporter.
Regarding the Central Bank of Libya crisis, it has negatively impacted us. We have transactions and payment deadlines with obligations that must be met on time, but the clearing system isn't working. If someone wants to receive money at a specific bank, the situation is currently unstable. Even transferring funds has become risky, leading to the closure of the clearing system. If we want to withdraw dollars from the bank, ever since this issue began, there's been a crisis in transferring money. The exchange rate is unstable. It changes daily, with both bank and cash rates increasing. Most payment methods are facing issues.
Given the severity of the problems relating to the central bank in Libya, efforts have been made to try and find a solution. On the 3rd of September, the House of Representatives from eastern Libya and the High State Council from the west in Tripoli signed a joint statement after 2 days of talks hosted by the United Nations Support Mission in Libya. They agreed to appoint a central bank governor and board of directors within 30 days. This is surely excellent news and a good way to put an end to all the problems.
And they have made an agreement to make an agreement. And they are quite expert at doing this. I mentioned that the Parliament, the House of Representatives, was elected in 2014. The High Council of State was elected in 2012. And they have been kind of locked in a dance ever since of agreeing to agree to a deal in order to play for time and to try to kind of grow their influence in the country. So there is not a high degree of faith that these two people who have failed to ever actually make an agreement beyond agreeing to agree something will suddenly be able to do so, especially given the amount of political pressure that will be on them from the Dbeibehs and the Haftars. But I think that this initial agreement helps to play into the atmosphere of pressure on the Dbeibehs and on the new board of governors right now.
The recent UN meetings and the agreement that was announced was a start, but nothing in life, nor Libya, is guaranteed. There are other steps that can be taken.
It was an all or nothing kind of bet. It was like they were obviously focusing on the version where things succeed, right? Where things actually pay off. If you have access to all the money, you can dedicate a portion of it to placating the public and giving all kinds of social gifts, and everything, would go fine because your popularity would go up, and then you would, think about the fiscal problems later on. I mean, that was kind of the plan. But it is true that what is happening is obviously not success. It's starting to look like failure. And now I think the UN could do a lot of useful work at this particular point by clarifying to the instigators of the August 18th decree that they actually failed. And the sooner those people understand that they actually failed miserably, then if that happens, diplomacy will become possible.
As things stand, Dbeibeh doesn't look likely to admit failure. But he's not Libya's only leader. With oil, Libya also has a large reserve of political leaders, some of who did publicly commit to holding elections.
I don't know of a meaningful faction in Libya that has shown any kind of interest in unifying the country or striking a transparent political deal, or certainly organizing elections. I mean, it's been obviously self-evident from the first months after he swept into office in March 2021 that he was not interested in those things, and his rivals were not interested in those things, and the foreign states backing them were not genuinely interested in those things.
With the crisis at the Central Bank of Libya and the subsequent closure of the oil fields, the people of Libya, who need good leaders, are trapped between bickering and potentially violent factions. And the situation for them will get worse the longer it goes on.
The problem in Libya is that none of them have any authority. None of them have any public trust. None of the public even like them very much. They're just kind of there, and the public are repeatedly told that we will move when we can have elections, but elections aren't so convenient or possible right now, so you just have to be patient and to hold on. And this is the fundamental problem in Libya.
This episode of The New Arab Voice was written and produced by me, Hugo Goodridge, with additional help from Oliver Mitzi. Our theme music was by Omar El Phil. The New Arab Voice will be back with a new episode soon. Until then, you can find all our previous episodes on all major podcast platforms. You can also check out our Instagram page and Twitter account, both at TNA Podcasts, for additional content. And you can also email us, podcast@newarab.com. That's podcast@newarab.com. You can subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and you can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Don't forget to follow The New Arab on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region